Okay, today I'd like to talk about an important word used in art, um, and it's used in other areas. It's really one of the more important things about human perception, and the word is abstraction. The problem with abstraction is people in art sometimes, or students, are confused because they're thinking of abstract art, and um, some abstract art is non-representational, and so you could just have a canvas or a painting that had no recognizable image on it, and it might just focus on color being used in a particular way. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what abstraction actually means and then how it relates to certain forms of abstract art. To start with, I'm going to use some examples, some simple examples. Later, I'm going to show you a painting of candles, and that is a realistic representation of candles, but it still is not the actual candle that was photographed and then painted off the photograph, so it's an abstraction. The first thing that you could do if you were abstracting a candle, you could take it down to the point where you turned it into a symbol, and the symbol might look like a candle and most people would recognize that it was a candle. You could further abstract it and turn it into an eye with an upside down comma on top, and that would be an abstraction, a further abstraction. Turned it into a symbol, and at the point that it's an eye with an upside down comma on top, now maybe it becomes an element of some language, some written language. So language is an abstraction from speech. Let's say that people were speaking and they were talking about things, and then slowly they developed pictures, and then maybe evolved the pictures into symbols, and the symbols then into a written language. So it's a process of abstraction that gets us from the actual thing that we're describing to the thing that we're representing by our description. Now, in science, there's other examples of this sort of abstraction. E equals mc squared represents the release of energy from matter, and if you release the energy, there's a tremendous amount of energy wrapped up in matter. And so a sentence that describes it, energy equals mass times the speed of light times the speed of light, is then represented by E equals mc squared, which could represent an atomic bomb, a blast. You've seen the mushroom cloud. You might represent it by vectors moving away from a point where the energy's been released, or in the case of photons, the symbol is usually a little squiggly arrow to represent a photon. So that's an abstraction, the photon being light, and a squiggly arrow is an abstract representation of light. These symbols help us understand things, simplify them into a term that you can look at, because when you're just looking at light in reality, it's a pretty complicated thing. I'm sitting here looking around and I see things, and what I'm seeing is reflected light, with the exception of the actual screen on the computer, which is emitting light. So another abstraction that I kind of like from science is a Feynman diagram, where you might have two electrons that are interacting. They exchange a photon. Their momentum is changed, and one goes one direction and one goes the other. When the electron that receives the photon, its momentum is changed, and the momentum of the first one is changed when it emits the photon. So that's an interesting abstraction developed by Richard Feynman, which has a tremendous amount of mathematical information just represented as a symbol. And you can see which interaction you're talking about without actually looking at the equations. So those are some examples in science. Now I'd like to go to one of my favorite artists for this purpose because he did so much in both abstract, non-representational, and photorealist artwork. He still is working, and he's an interesting artist if you haven't ever looked into his work. There's a painting of Candles by Gerhard Richter. Now, that is a photorealistic representation of a photo of candles, and he painted it, and it's hard to tell sometimes in his paintings whether they're actually a photograph or a painting unless you're up close and you were looking. So that is a photoreal representation. Further back in this book, I have a couple of examples of his non-representational abstract work. And these paintings were pretty amazing. I saw these that are in this book in a show in Chicago one time, and they're some of the most interesting abstract non-representational works I've seen, emphasizing on color and the interaction of colors. Another one of Gerhard Richter's experiments that's interesting this is an abstraction where you might not be able to see this until he's presented it in this way, but he painted a painting with a bunch of different colors. So I'll look here, it says 4,096 colors. He painted a painting with 4,096 colors. And the thing that it represents is the fact that the human eye can only see a finite number of colors. If you start looking at that painting, you realize you can't tell the difference between a lot of the colors in there. Sure, there's certain ones, but there's only a limited number of colors that your eye can distinguish from another, especially presented in a random pattern like this. So, Gerhard Richter's a good artist to look at when you're talking about the extremes of abstraction. There's abstract art that is representational, like Cubism, where they're messing with the concept of time. Marcel Duchamp had a painting called A Nude Descending a Staircase, and it's a figure that's fractured like a Cubist painting, and it represents movement of a person going down the stairs over time. So you don't just see the person standing at the top of the stairs, you see fractured little planes of movement as the figure descends the stairs. You could also have something called motion blur, where some things are blurry and you assume that you're seeing change, and if you see something and you think you're seeing change, you're also experiencing time. Time is an interesting element in art because you don't often think of it being involved. You make a painting, a pointillist painting, let's say, and like Seurat, and the people are just there, and it's a moment in time captured, but you don't necessarily see any movement or change in the picture. Edward Hopper paintings would be another example where it's a moment in time and you don't see movement, whereas an Alexander Calder sculpture is meant to move and the pieces move around. It's called a kinetic sculpture, but in that case you are seeing time because you're seeing change, things moving around. So there's lots of ways that we abstract things and lots of ways we see things. And I just want to make sure that I plan on making some videos, tutorial videos on how to create certain types of art. And I use this word abstraction a lot of times, and I have found that it confused some of my students the way I was using it. So I wanted to clarify that before I go on to any other videos. Thank you.